Mr. John McDonnell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Thank you. After a disastrous election campaign and a party conference that literally fell apart, yesterday's budget sole purpose was to revive the fortunes of the Conservative Party and maybe fend off for a time the Tory pack that have been hounding the Chancellor week after week. But actually what this budget showed, it showed just how out of touch and cut off from the real world of the economy and the real lives of people the Chancellor and this government really is. Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor said on Sky News only this morning, the UK economy is fundamentally strong. What's strong about an economy where economic growth has been downgraded to the lowest in G7 countries? What's strong about an economy where productivity growth has been revised down to the lowest since modern records began? Where business investment is, and I quote the OBR, significantly lower than expected in March, and where real pay and living standards continue to deteriorate. The official growth forecasts from the government's own Office for Budget Responsibility were the worst in its history. No government in modern times has ever presented a set of growth forecasts where growth in every year is less than 2%. Productivity growth is forecast to have ground to a halt this year and barely increase next year. This too, the worst downgrade in the OBR's history. The squeeze on living standards is now so great that the Resolution Foundation estimate that real pay will not return to its pre-crash levels until 2023.
On that point, the Shadow Chancellor is making out a very powerful case. The Governor of the Bank of England has said that the last time workers suffered such wage stagnation was 150 years ago, when Victoria was on. It was in the Crown, when we had Gladstone and Disraeli in number 10 Downing Street, when Darwin was evolving the theory of evolution, and when trade unions were illegal. Does the Shadow Chancellor agree to me that the evidence clearly is this? Under a Labour government, wages go up under...
Order! Before we go any further in this debate, which has only just started, I should explain to the House that there are a great many people who have indicated that they wish to speak this afternoon. Speeches will have to be time-limited and short, and it is simply not fair for people to make very long interventions and then possibly not stay for the whole debate, whereas some other colleagues, I'm not suggesting the honourable gentleman won't, he is an honourable gentleman and knows how to behave in the chamber, but it is perfectly in order and good debating practice for the Shadow Chancellor and everyone else to take lots of interventions in order that we can have a debate, but interventions must be short. And members must recognise that every minute that's taken up in an intervention takes a minute off the speech of someone who waits to speak all day. Now, it's a matter of being fair and decent to each other. I wonder how that will work. Mr. McDonnell.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I will take some interventions, but I'm cognizant of what you've said about the need to ensure all people can speak. Can I just respond to my honourable friend? Look, we all knew that an election of a Tory government would set us back. Yes. What we didn't appreciate, it would set us back essentially. Yes, absolutely. Productivity. Absolutely. Average annual pay is now projected to be £1,030 lower in 2022 than was forecast in the March 17 budget. And it's those delivering our key services, the nurses, the midwives, the firefighters, the teachers, who are worse off than they were a decade ago. There's nothing here, nothing that can be considered remotely strong. This is a weak economy. In terms of growth, it's now the weakest in the G7. And we are in this mess, let's remember, because in the last 7 years, The government have implemented policies that have undermined and weakened our economy. And the Chancellor was a key figure in all those government's policies. He and his colleagues were warned that austerity spending cuts would fail to bring the debt or the deficit under control, that instead they would undermine the real economy. We were promised in 2010 by the present Chancellor's predecessor that, that the deficit would be cleared by 2015. Yet today as well, the debt burden is still rising. The Chancellor borrowed more in his first year in the job than any Chancellor in history. Give way to the honourable gentleman.
Giving way. You paint a very negative picture. Can you explain, therefore, why patient satisfaction in the NHS is the highest for 20 years? We have the lowest unemployment for 43 years and the highest employment in our history.
They're now waiting lists in the NHS of 4 million and predicted to go to 5 million because of the lack of investment. The number of people employed we welcome. The increase in employment we welcome. 800,000 of them are on zero-hour contracts. We now have over 2 million people in insecure work. It's no wonder people are anxious about their futures. If I can come back to the honourable gentleman, I certainly will. As I said, the Chancellor has borrowed more in his first year in the job than any other Chancellor in history. 145 billion, over £5,000 per household. The OBR now expect the deficit in 2021 to be almost 3 times higher than it forecast in March. They blame this deterioration on the collapse in productivity growth, but productivity growth has collapsed because investment has fallen. Government investment is £20 billion less in real terms today than it was in the last year of the last Labour government. Can't remember who wants to intervene. The gentleman there.
Thank you very much for giving way. Can I ask him, or indeed his iPad, how much it would cost to service the government debt in the event that his own spending plans ever came to fruition?
I welcome the opportunity to respond to the honourable gentleman, because what we've said very, very clearly, unlike this government, on our fiscal rule we will not borrow for day-to-day expenditure. We will borrow to invest. That investment will grow the economy, and as a result of that growth will cover any need to borrow. That's what any sensible government is doing right the way across the globe, right the way across Europe. That's why it's this attitude displayed by the honourable gentleman that has caused our economic problems. Lack of investment in 7 years, lack of investment that generates productivity.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, because many of the things that have been welcomed in this budget, and some have by people outside of this House, have been measures that we've been calling for since the downturn in 2008. And if they were right now, they were right back then. That means it's a consequence of austerity and economic policies followed by the Tories that has made our economy flatline for virtually 7 years.
The issue is whatever has been put forward in the budget yesterday is so trivial it will not have the effect that's required. Investment by businesses also is the lowest in the G7 countries. The few measures announced yesterday just won't address that. They won't close the gap between the south and the rest of the country by investing in a rail project in the north east that will receive just 2% of the total cost of Crossrail in London. Our economy and our people will only reach their potential when there's real new investment brought forward by government on the scale needed to meet the opportunity. The right approach from 2010 would have been to target the real economy and real investments to produce growth, and so bring the deficit into line. Because the investment that was needed then did not materialise, productivity growth has stagnated. And because productivity growth has fallen away, the forecast deficit has been widened by the OBR to some £30 billion by 2021. The government knows austerity isn't working. It has been reduced to fiddling the figures now to meet its own targets. Let me just do this quote from the OBR, which I think is quite important, about how the government is going to meet some of its targets. And I quote, the OBR were damning on this point. It said this: the government has ensured that net debt still falls fractionally as a share of GDP in 2018-2019 and it has achieved this largely by announcing fresh sales of RBS shares and by passing regulations that ease local and central government control over housing associations in England. Creative vacancy on a scale we've not seen under any government. The government has, in other words, met its own debt target barely by exploiting a reclassification of housing association debt and putting in some extraordinary optimistic forecasts for its sales of RBS shares.
Of the right honourable gentleman, and I'm not generally trying to find a way out of our problems that we can agree. I accept his point that he wants to borrow more to invest. The trouble is we're already paying in interest more than what we spend on defence and police, just on paying interest on our debt. So what I really want from him is, I understand where he's coming from, but whatever you spend this money on, the interest will still be accrued. So how will he deal with that?
Debt under his government has gone up by nearly 800 billion. And it's debt, it is debt to pay for failure. It is debt to pay for failure rather than to pay for investment. Because if you borrow to invest, you grow the economy, and on that basis you put more people to work with more skills, higher wages, they pay more taxes, and it pays for itself. That's the lesson that they still haven't learned. The government appears, as is demonstrated today, to be completely out of touch with the mess our economy is in. And you know also, they have no understanding of the consequences of their choices on the lives of our people. No. They do not seem to grasp the scale of what's happening to our people out there. No. The Chancellor has tried to claim income inequality is falling. He doesn't seem to be aware that over 1 million food parcels have been handed out in this, the 6th richest economy on the planet. Inequality is not falling. He may well be aware that London is home to more billionaires than ever before. But does he ever know that there are more homeless people than ever? How could he claim inequality is falling when that stark comparison is made? For the poorest, this government's decisions will make them poorer still. And you know, buried away in the annex at the very back of the Treasury's own distribution analysis, is the truth on this. And this is what it says: the poorest fifth are being made poorer by the changes this government is implementing. But those inside the poorest fifth will lose almost £250 a year. And you know, the House of Commons Library again has published its figures. It has confirmed that the burden of the cuts, 86% of the cuts made in tax and benefit measures since 2010 have fallen on who? Women. Is that what equality is about under this government? 86% on the shoulders of women. I'll come back to the honourable lady, certainly. On housing, the government's proposed solution for the crisis is inept and counterproductive. The stamp duty cut for first-time buyers will not bring forward the new homes we need. No wonder the OBR expects only 3,500 additional sales to happen from the change. They say, and I quote again, that thanks to the price rises, the main gainers from the policy are people who already own property. The problem is simple. Perhaps it does need explaining. You can't solve a problem of housing supply by driving up housing demand. And you know, we're not the only people saying this. Conservative ministers reviewed a stamp duty reduction and said this, that the cut had not had a significant impact on improving affordability for first-time buyers. And setting a target of 300,000 homes a year for the mid-2020s does little for the housing crisis we're suffering today. And the number, I'll come back to the honourable lady. I think the honourable lady was first, so I'll come with her. That's all right.
It was going back a few points, but the people in Taunton Dean speak to me. They've actually got more money in their pockets, which is what they want. We have put up the national living wage. We have cut income tax by raising the personal allowance, and again we have frozen fuel duty. So people have actually got thousands more in their pockets than they had under the Labour government.
It's so good. Deborah, it's so good. You paid to sit there.
Can I just And can I just say, I know the honourable lady is well-intentioned, but can I just say she's displayed an ignorance about what large numbers of people happen to her. Can I just suggest this to her? That I don't wish to be patronising anyway, but well, if that is the way it's interpreted, that's certainly not how it's meant to be. I just say that all of us who are on relatively high wages need to understand and be very careful when we talk about levels of income and levels of wealth, when we know so many people, 4 million of our children, are actually living in poverty, and 2/3 of those children are living in households where someone is at work. That says something about low pay to me, and it should do to all of us. I'll come back to the honourable gentleman. Can I just say that the number of people sleeping on our streets has doubled since the Conservatives came to our office in 2010. Over 3,500 people were forced to sleep on our streets last year. We have 80,000 households living in temporary accommodation because councils simply don't have anywhere to house them. I repeat, in the 6th richest country in the world, over 120,000 of our children without a home to call their own, living in temporary accommodation. That's up 60% since this government's been in power. That means, and we've seen it in our constituencies, children brought up in places that are often not safe, not having to share communal bathrooms and kitchens, and being robbed of a normal family life and childhood. Ministers don't seem to understand the strength of anger many of us on these benches feel that our constituents are being forced to live in overcrowded, unsafe and inadequate housing. The government had the opportunity to deliver the funding that would build the homes we need. With only 1/3 of the £44 billion announced today genuinely new, and no extra government investment in new affordable homes, this government's record of failure on housing will continue to blight the lives of hundreds of thousands trapped in overpriced, inadequate housing. Sorry, I thought there was someone else, but oh no, I'll give on to a lady, yes.
I thank the honourable gentleman. As somebody who was working in the construction industry in 2008-9 and who watched the decimation of that industry at the tail end of the last Labour government, and noted that nobody sprung to our aid to keep people in work in the industry, we have had to start from the go-get. We have built 217,000 houses this year, and that is nearly double what was built in the last time of the Labour government. You walked away from the industry at that time, so to stand there and sanctimoniously tell us that you did support us is wrong.
Could I ask the honourable lady to re-examine the history of that period? And I just pointed to the Kickstart programme was developed by the Labour government, which was both in terms of private and the public sector to enable building to happen. Well, I just asked the honourable lady, and we can get a brief during that period. I understand what she's saying, and it was an immensely difficult period for the economy, and she's right, and many people suffered. But can I just say to her that her party supported the policies to deregulate the banks that brought about the speculation that resulted in the economic crisis in this country and elsewhere. There are thousands also, Madam Deputy Speaker, who are trapped in poverty. The Child Poverty Action Group estimates that as many as 1 million children, could be pushed into poverty as a result of cuts to universal credit. The introduction of universal credit has been a disaster that's pushed many thousands of people into despair and, in many cases, outright destitution. Food bank charities have reported that they've gathered an extra 2,000 tonnes of food to cope with demand as a result of the introduction of universal credit. The Trussell Trust report that the use of food banks is up 30% in areas where universal credit is being rolled out. But the amendments offered by the Chancellor yesterday and mentioned in the statement today are so feeble as to strongly suggest that he and this government simply do not grasp the scale of this problem. Members need to know what this poverty means for children in our society. It means not having a winter coat this winter, being left behind when the rest of the class goes on a school trip, and yes, from the reports last year, going hungry during school holidays in their thousands. The Chancellor did nothing yesterday for self-employed people, second earners, lone parents or disabled people, all of whom have seen their living standards suffer, particularly acutely under UC. He failed to mitigate the £3 billion a year cut slashed from the UC programme by his predecessor. He failed to address the impact of the Social Security freeze and universal credit, I'll come back to you, Honourable Gentleman, due to push millions into poverty. The additional funds put in place amount to £1 returned for every £10 the government is cutting from the system. This means that those claiming universal credit will now have to take their first payment as a loan, so they face 12 months of reduced payments, and to some of the most desperate people in the country, to those already drowning in debt, the Chancellor has offered what? More debt. More debt. And for those newly registered for universal credit and facing destitution this Christmas, the Chancellor had nothing to say. Not a single extra penny, however inadequate, will be available for the new year. 59,000 families will be left without any support over the Christmas period, families that include 40,000 of this country's children. And the percentage of children living in relative poverty is the highest since records began in 1961, in the sixth richest country in the world. And local councils, I just say to the honourable members opposite, local councils are being starved of funds they need to protect the most vulnerable children in our society. Charities on the front line are clear and they're reporting solidly. The cuts to parenting classes, children's centres, substance misuse prevention, teenage pregnancy support, short breaks for disabled people risk, what the charities are saying, risk turning the current crisis into a catastrophe for the next generation of children and families. This year, a record 70,000 children have been taken into care. 1 in 64 children in England is at risk of abuse or neglect. There are 1,200 fewer children's centres than in 2010, and funding for early intervention to protect children is down 55%. 8 in 10 schools have no funding to support children with special needs, and funding for early intervention to protect children, down by 55%, as I've said. There was not a single penny extra to address this emerging crisis in our children's services in the budget. I say this now, and I say this across the House. The Chancellor and the Government are failing some of the most vulnerable children in our society. And I urge the Government to look again now at this issue that's emerging as an emerging crisis. And it goes on. In education, schools are facing the first funding cuts per pupil in real terms since the 1990s. Head teachers are being forced to go begging to parents for funds to pay for basic supplies. 5,000 head teachers written to the government asking just that those funds that have been cut be returned. Yeah. In the Prime Minister's own constituency, one head is asking parents for £1 a day to help pay for stationery. The National Audit Office says schools face a £1.7 billion real terms cut funding by 2020. For younger children, as I said, there are 1,000 fewer nursery places and childminders. 8 in 10 schools being left without funding to adequately provide for special needs pupils. It means our most vulnerable children deprived of the counselling or support they need, spending break times away from their friends alone and having their education discriminated against.
Thank you very much for giving way. I just want to make a quick point on the point of children with SEN provision. I was told by a head teacher in Hull that there is not enough money for post-16 SEN provision because they can't cut the number of teaching assistants that they need because of the ratios needed to care for these children. So she's looking at a situation of not being able to offer a full-time school placement for post-16 children with SEN. And does he agree with me that that is absolutely appalling?
It's shocking. It is shocking. It is absolutely shocking when we, as a society, are looking to integrate everybody into the mainstream as best we can, and it means that those children will be deprived for the rest of their lives. More than 4,000 children with an approved education and health social care plan are still not receiving the provision they're entitled to, which confirms what my honourable friend has reported. The Local Government Association are now warning the Government that the cuts to local government will mean schools being forced to turn away students with special needs. To compensate for this, yesterday's budget offered £177 million for additional maths and IT teachers, supposedly to make us fit for the future at a time when just 10% of our schools offer IT GCSEs. £177 million to compensate, £177 million to compensate for £1.7 billion, £1 given back for every £10 taken away. And capital spending on schools is scheduled to be cut by £600 million over this Parliament at a time when class sizes are rising. And on the NHS, the experts and the health professionals are agreed the NHS is approaching breaking point. The NHS needs proper funding. The Chief Executive of the NHS England has said our National Health Service needs £4 billion this year to prevent it falling over. He's warned of 5 million people being left on the waiting list without additional funding.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Is he aware that within the NHS, CCGs are looking to introduce new taxes on patients? Kernow CCG intends and is proposing to make kidney dialysis patients pay for transport to their dialysis. This is a death tax of £120 a month, either dialysis or death, and that's their option.
Under the figures that have been announced this week in the budget, there'll be more of this. There'll be more rationing. There'll be more people suffering. There'll be more people's lives put at risk as a result. Under this government, 4 million people are now waiting for care, the highest level in a decade. More than 100,000 patients were left waiting more than 2 weeks to see a specialist after being diagnosed with cancer. And more than 1 in 10 did not start treatment within 62 days. 3 in 10 of the most urgent 999 calls for help are going answered within the targeted time. 3 in 10 only. Yet the government has brought forward less than half the amount that is needed and, well, yes, other professional sober assessments say is needed. And the claim in yesterday's budget that £10 billion in capital funding is available is totally misleading. Absolutely. The government will provide less than half of this. The remainder will come from selling off the NHS estates or from the private sector. And nor is the pay cap that has driven hard-working public sector workers to despair being tackled. The dedication of the staff is extraordinary. There are nurses waiting behind after 12-hour shifts to give care to keep the system from imploding. These are the same NHS nurses who have seen their pay fall so much in real terms that 1 in 4 of them must take a second job to make ends meet. The Royal College of Nurses reports nurses even visiting food banks, such as their discretion. But it isn't possible to run a health service worthy of the name on the unpaid and the underpaid dedication of its staff alone. And the Chancellor is able to offer nothing for them. I've given way to the honourable gentleman, and I'm worried, as the Deputy Speaker said, to make sure people are fully involved. Thank you. The Chancellor was able to offer nothing for them. The cap isn't being removed because, as the Treasury briefed once the Chancellor sat down, any pay rises the pay review boards offer above 1% must be taken from existing budgets. It's a derisory offer to make after 7 years of real-term pay cuts. And worse than that, for NHS nurses, any additional pay will be linked to agenda for change, modernisation, and what they really mean, threatening their working conditions, tearing up their terms and conditions of pay. Well, final one.
I think the Shadow Chancellor has given way. Is it not also a con, because 55% of civil servants' pay is not covered by a peer review body?
That's exactly that, and that's how the government up until now has avoided its own responsibility to ensuring that people, other civil servants, have a proper pay rise. I also say, and for those in social care, with the system still approaching what the Quality Care Commission calls tipping point, the Chancellor has not offered a single penny either. Nothing. Let me just turn to the environment. The Chancellor had a few choice words about electric cars yesterday. I thought it was a wonderful metaphor, a driverless car. But on the bigger picture, the budget is potentially disastrous. The fact that there will be no new low-carbon electricity levies until 2025 could spend the end of much of the low-carbon development in the UK. There was not a single mention in the Chancellor's speech of renewables, sustainable sources of energy or investment in domestic energy efficiency. It's quite clear that beyond a few gimmicks, this is not in any sense a priority for the government. And the Chancellor referred extensively to technological change, which offers a huge potential for our economy and our society if we're prepared to commit the investment needed. But it was a Conservative-led government, of which the Chancellor is a member, that cut research funding by £1 billion in real terms. And unlike the Chancellor and his party, we on this side of the House know that to realise the possibilities of new technology will require a government committed to providing the funding and the long-term investment needed. Not a government as this one, repackaging existing announcements on fibre optics and 5G in consecutive budgets, or the one that reallocates funds it's already allocated a year ago in the autumn statement, claiming it's new research funding. The government says it's aiming to reach the OECD average of 2.4% of GDP spend on R&D by 2027, but after years of languishing below it, Britain should be aiming to be above the OECD average, rather than belatedly hitting an average a decade from now. Even the target displays a lack of ambition and foresight. And they have the same problem with Brexit. They never planned for it before the referendum, and now they can't see beyond their own slogans after it. 17 months after the referendum result, there's not a single agreement with the EU on any point. They're lurching towards the hardest possible Brexit, ripping up our existing relationship with our closest trading partners instead of trying to work to create a new one. Every major business group has begged them to take a different approach, from the CBI to the EEF to the BCC, the British Chamber of Commerce. Already, businesses are pulling back investment for fear of what might come. So this government doesn't just lack ambition, they won't listen to advice and can't seem to see just how disastrous a cliff-edge plunge out of the EU would be for our economy. The Chancellor trailed this budget as making Britain fit for the future. What it actually demonstrated, as my right honourable friend, the member for Islington North, said yesterday, is that this is a government no longer fit for office. Too divided to deliver. The budget demonstrated that this is increasingly a government without purpose, divided and in disarray, whose confidence is sapped, whose time is up. I just say to them, it is better to go with a bit of dignity rather than just go with a bit of dignity rather than it is better to go with a bit of dignity. A bit of dignity left rather than humiliating disintegration. Labour is ready and willing now to form the government that this country needs, rather this shambles that cannot even be described as a government.